Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 29 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. Now remember at this point we're talking about Ambiorix's revolt in about 54 BCE. So we've set up the scene, right, where Caesar's come back from Britain, he's had to spread his army out, and the fort that we're really focusing on is the one that we've highlighted here with the red arrow, where you have Sabinus and Cotta. Okay, so Ambiorix has already shown up to this fort, he's given his message, right, he gave him a big speech after that attack saying, you're in trouble, the Germans are coming, all these different things. And we've been seeing the Roman response, right? From Cotta, now we're going to get Sabinus, and they're debating on what they should do, whether or not they should believe Ambiorix. Okay, so that's where we're going to pick up the story. Now, before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you in these videos, the first thing you want to do is just make sure that you know the vocab really well. So there's a lot of good commentaries out there with different vocab lists. You should just take one, pre-read this chapter, make a list of all the vocab. You can find a bunch of them online. Even on my website, you can find some with Quizlet, things like that. But just try to get a good vocab list that you understand what the words are. Even if you're not sure of the grammar, that's kind of half the battle. Just know what the words are. Then you can use those commentaries to try to help you with the grammar too, right? So it's always a good thing to kind of pre-read a little bit. The other thing I'd suggest is read this story aloud, right? It's always a good idea. If you're a student, find someone in class, read the chapter to them, right? That way you work on your speaking, your pronunciation, then have your classmate read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. These are a great way to really lock in the Latin long term and not just memorize it, for like a quick test that week and then forget it, a day later, okay? Particularly if you're doing this for an AP class where you're trying to memorize and remember a lot of different information. A lot of Latin, it's really, really hard to do. So this would be a good way to do it. And even if you're not doing it for an AP class, it's still a good way to lock in that long-term memory and not shut off those parts of your brain, okay? The other thing that I always recommend that you do is do the read and reread method, right? So read through this chapter once, write down any problem areas you have. It might be a word, a sentence, anything it might be, just write it down. And then when you're done with the read of the chapter, go back and look at your list, right? If it's a word you don't know, that's really easy. Look it up with a vocab, any vocab tool, you'll find it. If it's grammar, you might want to try looking at a commentary. There's a bunch of good ones out there, like I said, and they'll help you through it, right? So you can see what's going on and understand as you go. Try to shore up all the problem areas, then go back and read it again and keep repeating that process. And the list that you're writing should get smaller and smaller until you're able to read through this entire chapter without needing any help, without having anything on the list, right? And that you understand most, if not all of it. That's where you're trying to get to, right? And if you can do that, you know that you're in a really good place. So if you haven't done that, pause the video, go work on that, right? Go do it. But for the rest of the video, we're going to work our way through the story, or the chapter rather. And as long as your translation is somewhere in the area of mine, not that mine is ever perfect, but it should be a guidepost to help you through to make sure that you're understanding this, okay? So let's dive in. So like I said, we're having this debate between the Romans, right? They call it council in the fort. You have Sabinus, Cotta giving their different versions of what's going on. And now you're going to get Sabinus's retort, right? To what Cotta had said. Okay, so it starts with this. You have contra ea, teturius sero facturos clamitabat, cum maiores manus hostium adjunctis Germanis convenissent aut cum aliquid calamitatis in proximis hibernis esset acceptum. Okay, so this whole thing is starting with clamitabat, right? You have this idea of shouting, okay? So this is what we call the frequentive, right? So that extra it means that he kept shouting, right? So it's imperfect, but the idea is that he kept doing it over and over and over again. And we'll talk about why that's kind of an interesting word choice from Caesar. But it starts with Titurius, right? Which is Sabinus. So he kept shouting, clamitabating, right? Contra ea. This means literally something like against these things. But it's probably a better translation to say in reply to these things, meaning he's giving his reply against what Cotta and the other officers had just said, okay? So he kept shouting that. This whole thing is one big indirect statement, right? So we're getting another one of these chapters where basically you're getting the secondhand report from Caesar of what happened, right? We just saw this with Ambiorix's speech, and you're going to see it again, okay? So he kept shouting that they would act. Facturos here is really facturos esse, right? So you have that future infinitive. So it's talking about the Romans, so that the Romans would act is kind of the idea here. Sero, too late, okay? So he kept shouting that this is going to be all too late, okay? This isn't going to work. So then he's going to say why. And the cum here, you could translate when. Some commentaries even say after, right, is a good way to do it. But either way, right? So you have when greater bands, right? Maiores manus. The manus there, remember, it means like a band of soldier. It literally means like groups of troops, right? It comes from that word for hand, like handfuls of troops, right? So when greater bands of enemies, and then you have the ablative absolute there, right? So with the Germans having been added, right, or having added the Germans, adjunctis Germanis, when greater bands, convenisset, had convened, right? So he's saying after, we're going to be acting too late after this happens, right? When more bands of enemies show up and they're adding the Germans, right? That was the threat from Ambiorix, is saying the Germans are coming, right? And then you have, or when some aliquid calamitatis, right? Some calamity, right, had been received, you might say, esset acceptum, so had been received in neighboring winter quarters, right, in proximis hibernis, meaning something horrible goes wrong in one of the neighboring forts. Okay, then we go to the next line, right, and this is just a short sentence, but he says, "Brevem consulendi esse occasione." Okay, so we're still clamitabating, right? He was still shouting over and over again, right? That the opportunity, the occasionem, right? The opportunity of consulting, consulendi, right there is the genitive, not the genitive, rather the gerund, right? So he's saying that the occasion or the opportunity for consulting, right, for kind of talking it through was brief, right? Esse brevem, right? He's saying we don't have a lot of time to consult on this because the enemy is coming. That's kind of his big thought here. Okay. Then you have Caesarem arbitrari, profectum in Italiam, neque aliter carnutes interficiendi tesceti consilium fuisse capturos, neque eberones, si illi adesset, tanta contemptione nostri ad castra venturos esse. Okay, so again, you have this idea that he was clamitabating, right? So he was shouting all these things. So here again, he's shouting that they judged, or they thought, right, arbitrari, that Caesar, profectum there is really profectum esse, okay? So they thought that Caesar had departed, right? You have that deponent infinitive there of proficisco, right? Profectum esse. So that he had departed into Italy, right? So everyone thinks that Caesar is gone, right? And he says, otherwise, aliter, neither, right? He was shouting that neither the Carnutes, right, would have made a plan, right? You have consilium fuisse capturos there. And remember that concilium, right? When you put the plan concilium capere, it's an idiom that means like to adopt an argument, right? To make a plan is kind of one way to think of it. So he's saying the Carnutes would not have made a plan, right? And it's the plan of killing Tascetius, right? Interficiendi Tasceti, right? So in other words, he's saying they never would have killed Tascetius, okay? And you have that gerundive, that genitive gerundive of interficiendi, modifying Tascetius, okay? So again, you would translate that as of killing Tascetius. Nor the Eburones, right? This other group. So he talks about the Carnutes. Now we have the Eburones, right? He says, nor that the Eburones, remember it's a big indirect statement, so he's still shouting, right, raging, that nor the Eburones, if he were present, see Iliad Esset, that's talking about Caesar, right? So in other words, he's saying if that one, right, Ile, if he were here, meaning not in Italy, right? Nor would they have come, right, when turos esse. So there you have the future infinitive, right? So you have this idea of, they wouldn't have come to the camp ad castra with tanta contemptione, with such a contempt, you might say, nostri for us, right? So he's saying here, if Caesar was still here, they never would have done these things, which again is kind of an interesting commentary, because remember, Caesar's writing this, so it's Caesar making him sound like if I had been there, none of this would have happened. And then we continue the next line. You have non hostem actorem, sed rem spectare, sub esse renum, magno esse Germanis dolori ario visti, mortem et superiores nostras victorias, ... right? So he's still raging on, right? So he was shouting, or he kept shouting. So again, it's saying that, he kept raging that he didn't see, right, the non spectator there. It's really talking about himself, right, that he didn't see the hostem, the enemy, as the auctorem, right, as the sort of agent of all of this, right? You could say author. I always feel like author is kind of odd in English, but more like the agent, right? So it's not the enemy that's the author, but the situation, the rem. So he's saying, in other words, it's not that we have, the enemy causing all this. It's our situation that's causing this big problem, right? So he's again klamitabating, right, raging on that the Rhenum subesse, the Rhine was nearby, right? He's like, we're near to the Rhine River, right? This is part of the problem. So the Rhine was nearby, subesse, right? And he's raging that the mortem Ariovisti, the death of Ariovistus, right? And here you have the double dative. So you're saying that the death of Ariovistus was a great sadness, right? A magno dolore to the Germans, Germanis, right? So he's saying that the death of Ariovistus here, this really kind of made everyone sad, angry is kind of the idea, right? Having this man die, and the superiores nostras victorias, and our recent victories. So that phrase is all going together, right? It's not just the death of Ariovistus, but it's the death of Ariovistus and our recent victories were a great sadness to the Germans, right? So they're upset at what's been going on here, okay? And then the sentence continues. You have ardere Galliam tot contumelis acceptis sub populi Romani imperium redactam superiore gloria rei militaris extincta, okay? So he rages on again, right? Klamitabat, he keeps klamitabating, right? Raging that Gaul was burning, ardere, right? So that Gaul was on fire, right? There's a rebellion happening here. So why is Gaul on fire? Well, you have tot contumelis acceptis. So with so many insults, you might say, the contumelis, right? Having been received, right? So acceptis, you have the ablative absolute there. So with so many insults having been received, and the redactam there is really going with gallium, right? It's a perfect passive participle. I believe it's redigo, and it's modifying gallium. So it's saying with so many things having been received, so many insults, and it's talking about Gaul having been reduced, right? Under the Populi Romani Imperium, under the power of the Roman people. Okay, so again, he's saying that the former power, all this power of Gaul, everyone's upset because they're having all these insults, so many insults received because the Romans are conquering them, right? So that's the reason he's going for Gallium ardere, right? Gaul burning. Okay, then you have the superiore gloria extincta, right? So you have the other ablative absolute here. You're saying with its former glory, superiore, right? Gloria, its former glory of military affairs, you might say rei militaris, right? So military things having been extinguished, extincta, right? So we're getting a really interesting line here from Caesar where he's giving you kind of his view on what's happening through the lens of Sabinus, right? So Caesar's telling you that the Gauls are upset because of all these things, and he's talking about how Gaul has been reduced to basically nothing under the power of the Roman people, and it's all this military glory is gone. We'll talk about that later. That's an interesting way of describing it, because part of you should pause and say, if all their military glory is gone and all their power is reduced, right, and they have no power left, why is the rebellion happening, right? So Caesar here is almost giving you a side note, making it seem like, yeah, Gaul's pacified, we're all good. So then it should be like, well, then why is this rebellion happening, right? If you have everything under control, how is this happening? So it's kind of an interesting contradiction, at least I always read it that way, that he's describing through Sabinus that Gaul is kind of pacified and reduced and brought to nothing, and yet they're about to have a rebellion, and then in following years they're going to have Vercingetorix's rebellion, right? It just doesn't seem to add up. But he's giving you reasons here of why everyone's ardere, Gaul was burning, incensed, right? Why everyone is mad. Okay. And then it continues. You have postremo quis hoc sibi persuaderet sine certa re ambioriem ad eius modi concilium descendisse, right? And it's a question, so I guess it should be descendisse, right? It's sort of this rhetorical question, okay? So the part you want to do here is postremo, lastly or finally, right? He's kind of continuing his rage here. So the verb here, persuade, remember, takes a dative here. So you have the imperfect subjunctive. So you can almost translate this as finally or lastly, who would persuade, or I guess could persuade himself, Sibi, of this thing, hoc, right? So he's saying who could persuade himself of this thing, right? That sine certare, without sort of certain proof, you might say, right? And it's almost like it's in apposition. So namely that without certain proof, or without so I think some commentaries say without a reliable reason, or a certain reason, right? That Ambiorix had lowered himself. Descendisse, right? Is where you want to go there, right? So you have the perfect infinitive. That he had literally like lowered himself, and what that means is that Ambiorix is not acting as a leader, right? He's kind of lowering himself to this rebellion, right? And what did he lower himself to? Well, ad concilium eius modi, to this kind of plan, right? So literally to a plan of this kind. So the rhetorical question is, who would ever believe, or who would convince themselves that Ambiorix, this great Gallic leader, would lower himself, right? Lower his station to such a traitorous plan, right? That's the sort of rhetorical question getting asked here. Okay, so now we continue on. And you have suam sententiam in utramque partem esse tutam, si nihil esse durius nullo cum periculo ad proximam legionem perventuros, si Gallia omnis cum Germanis consentiret unam esse in celeritate positam salutam. Okay, so you have suam sententiam, right? So he's still raging on, right? Clamitabating, right? So all big one big indirect statement. So he's still raging or shouting that his opinion was tutam, it was secure, right? Safe or secure on each side, in utramque partem, right? So in other words, he's saying my opinion is the right one, right? It's secure on each side, right? There's nothing wrong with my plan here, my opinion. So now he continues on sort of his opinion, right? He says, si nihil esset durius. So if nothing was more harsh or harsher, right? I guess you could say. That's the neuter comparative. Okay, so it's basically saying like when he says if nothing was harsher, meaning like if nothing else kind of goes wrong, is really what he means. Okay, then you have perventuros. So the perventuros there is really perventuros esse. Okay, so it's saying, if this, whatever, if nothing goes harsher, right, or more wrong, that they might come, right, perventuros esse, the future there. So they might come with no danger, nullo cum periculo, right? So they would come with no danger to the nearest legion, ad proximam legionem, right? So he's like, if there's nothing else, no other problem here, we'll be able to come to the nearest fort, right? Then he continues and he says, if all of Gaul, right, si Gallia omnis, if all of Gaul, rather, consentire there, you can almost translate as like agreed or are in agreement with, is kind of one way to do it. But if all Gaul agreed or kind of sided with the Germans, cum Germanis, right, if that happens, right, then you have unam salutam, the one safety, right? The one bit of safety, positam esse, had been placed in speed, in celeritate. So again, this part of the argument is interesting. He's saying that, if everything's fine, if there's no further danger, he's like, don't worry about it. We'll be able to get or arrive at the nearest legion without any problem. But if there's this rebellion and all of Gaul somehow rises up with the Germans, right? This big threat that he's hearing about from Ambiorix, he's like, then we need to leave, right? We have to go in speed. Their one safety, their unam salutem, right? Their one sort of manner of or means of safety is to get out of there quickly, right? That's what he's getting at, right? Speed is the only way that they're going to be safe. Okay. And now we get to the last part. Okay, and we end the chapter on this. You have cotae quidem atque eorum qui dissentiret concilium quem habere exitum, in quo si praesens periculum non at certe longinqua obsidione fames esset timenda, right? You have a question at the end, timenda. So he ends on this, and I think sometimes you see timenda followed by a period. The version I'm using, the commentary on the Mueller text, right, often puts the question mark there, okay? So he starts here at the end, and again, this is Caesar by putting cauda right at the beginning, which is pretty emphatic, okay? So he starts by saying, cautai, so indeed, quidem, right? Indeed, he says, you have of cauda, so something of cauda, and of those, so atque eorum, and of those who dissentire, of those who disagreed, meaning disagreed with Sabinus. So he says, what outcome, right? What exitum, what sort of outcome does the plan have? Concilium habere, right? So what outcome does the plan have, right? And he's talking about the people who don't agree, right? Meaning those like cauda and those who disagree. Well, what sort of outcome does your plan have? Okay. And remember here, the plan belongs to cauda and eorum qui dissentire, right? Those who disagreed. So he's saying, okay, your plan, cauda, and anyone who disagreed with him, right? He's asking the question again. He's raging, klamitabating, right? I should have said that. But he's saying, what sort of plan does what sort of outcome does your plan have, right? So in other words, if we stay here, he's like, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, and it's the plan in which, in quo, right? So he's talking about the plan. So he says, what sort of outcome do you have for this plan? In which if no present danger, praesens periculum, right? If no present danger, and it's kind of going with esset timenda there, right? At the bottom. So this is your passive periphrastic, right? When you have that gerundive, the timenda, going with the imperfect subjunctive here of esset. So it's expressing sort of like necessity, right? So one way that you see it translate, it's literally something like was going to be feared, I think is kind of one way, but more often you see it as like had to be feared. So it's saying, or he's asking the question, the rhetorical question. He says, okay, in this plan, in which if no present danger had to be feared, right? Esset timenda, but certainly, right? So in other words, he's saying if it's not this present danger, right? So again, like if it's not this, right, the present danger must be feared. He says certainly fames, hunger, right, from a longinqua obsidione, from a long siege, must be feared. Okay, so he's asking this again, sort of rhetorical question. He says, "Okay, cauda and all those who disagree with me," or he's raging on, he's klamitabating. He's like, "What's the outcome of your plan?" Right. So again, he asks, he's like, what's the outcome here? And it's this plan in which, okay, if you don't think present danger, right, needs to be feared, how are you going to handle a long siege, right? And he's like, aren't you afraid of hunger from a long siege? So he's asking this question of, one, they might attack us now, but he's like, we're not going to make it through a long siege, right? If they actually show up and attack us, okay? So this whole section is really the counterpoint that Sabinus is making, right, Titurius we started with, against cauda. So cauda's giving his version, and Sabinus is like, we got to get out of here, right? We got to run. And he's giving his counterpoint here, okay? So you want to notice a few things about this chapter. So one thing is that it started with klamitabat, right? We mentioned that before, the frequentive. So this is a really interesting choice of words from Caesar, because it keeps showing up in the entire chapter, right? It's all set up by this. And it shows this idea of that he's yelling over and over and over again. And a lot of commentaries point this out. I was jokingly calling it raging with Klamitaba, but that's kind of how it feels. He's just shouting at everyone, and this sort of unhinged rant, right, at the council, where he's like yelling about this and yelling about that and yelling about all these different things. Caesar chooses that description of Sabinus, and it almost makes him seem like he's not thinking clearly, right? He's just yelling and raging. That unstable leadership kind of comes through here, where you can't really trust what he's saying because he's just ranting at everyone, okay? The other thing that you want to notice is Caesar's again praising himself. So this situation is really a reflection on Caesar, right? How did you let this happen? But he's not going to take the blame. We've been saying this the whole time. He's going to deflect the blame to others, specifically Sabinus and Cotta. So whenever he gets the chance, he's kind of praising himself. So he's saying, none of this would have happened if I were there, right? The Carnutes and the Eburones would have never revolted if Caesar was there, but he puts it through Sabinus's words, right? So Sabinus comes off saying, man, if only we had Caesar. It's an interesting thing. He might have said this, who knows, but you have to remember that Caesar's the one writing this commentary, right? So it's just kind of an interesting way to do it. The other thing, like we mentioned, he's describing Gaul as subjugated, right? So he mentions in the words of Sabinus, right? He's saying Gaul is subjugated under military authority and all their former glories extinguished, all these things. That's kind of interesting because it's reinforcing Caesar's idea that he's, again, in total control, right? I control everything. They've been extinguished. Look how great I've done, right? As he goes off to Britain and all these adventures. But you should be wondering, like, is that true? Did he really do that? And if he had such control, why is this revolt happening? Why couldn't he handle it? So it seems like Caesar's hedging his bets here by saying, like, yeah, don't worry, Gaul's fine. It's not my fault. I had everything under control. I subjugated these people. Sabinus and Cotta are the ones who were too stupid and let this happen, right? It's just kind of an interesting way that he lays out the narrative. And again, he's squarely blaming Sabinus and Cotta, right? So he has the raging Sabinus. He's pointing out Cotta by name, all these different things. Caesar is always making sure that the audience knows who's making a mistake, and it's not going to be him. Okay, so hopefully this translation made some sense. If you have any questions at all on it or anything you're not sure of, feel free to put it in the comments below, and I'll be happy to help or explain more. Again, never that my translation is anything amazing, but it should kind of help you on your way. And you're trying to, again, reach a point where you can read through this, you understand what's happening without needing too much help. That's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck.